But that was not to be. Instead, the 20th century brought us an unprecedented century of global conflict, 2 world wars, and European colonialism that circled the globe. It also brought unprecedented scientific, industrial, technological, and social change. The world was changing at an unprecedented pace. And in 1959, the Soviet Union landed the first spacecraft, Luna 2, on the moon, and a decade later, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first human being to step on the surface of the moon. These remarkable achievements made ours the first generation to see the world as it had never been seen before, from outside. We were able to look back at this wondrous blue-green planet in a boundless blue-black space. We saw our planet as one. But did we gain a new consciousness of ourselves? Here my purpose is to do 3 things. First, to look at our century of 2 global conflicts as a tragic source, along with the end of European colonialism as a second source for one of the most remarkable developments of post-World War II era, the emergence of the dialogue of religions, the encounter and meeting of men and women from the world's faiths across the globe. Sometimes in these conversations we've had some problem with these words faith and with the word religions. That's a problem that I, in one way, don't really understand. Because all of the peoples of the world understand their faith traditions as religions, even though that is a word that specifically comes out of the Western traditions, and each of these traditions have their own names for what we in the West call religion. Secondly, then, I want to chart some of the features of this new way of dialogue that promises to redress relations between our traditions of religious and spiritual life, and thirdly, to look at the Gulen movement in the context of this new way of dialogue. I turn first to the 2 global conflicts. It was known as the First World War, the Great War, and the war to end all wars. It began as a conflict between Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and France, Great Britain, and the Russian Empire. Much of the war was a prolonged battle along the Western Front in Verdun, in France. At Verdun, the trench warfare went on for years, with one side then the other gaining and losing a yard or 2 of land, and here men died by the hundreds of thousands. When the war concluded in 1918, it had drawn in other countries, including the Ottoman Empire on the German-Austrian side and the United States on the Allied side. More than 15 million people were dead. And the war extended into Africa, the Middle East, India, and as far as the Pacific Islands of German Samoa, and China, the German port city of Qingdao. I remember visiting a World War I cemetery in France and being surprised to see among all the crosses the crescent moon. When I got closer, I realized there were markers for the Algerian Muslims who had fought and died in the war. There were also many Indians and Africans from the British colonies who died in the war, as well as Muslims from the Ottoman Empire. The end of the war meant the dismembering of the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and much of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East became protectorates under British and French, but the modern secular Republic of Turkey under Kemal Ataturk also emerged in 1923. Although the war to end all wars was concluded in 1918, it was only 29 years later that World War II began, when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. When the costliest war in the history of humanity ended in 1945, more than 50 million people were dead. And they were people from all around the world. It came to an end in Japan after the Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, obliterating the city and its population in an instant. It's a story about what happened in Hiroshima. The bomb fell, communication was cut off from Japan. They sent a plane from Japan to see what had happened, and they flew to Hiroshima, and the report back was, the city of Hiroshima has disappeared, because 90% of the city was gone in an instant. The end of the war also brought to light the horror of the Holocaust, Shoah, and the murder of 70% of the European Jewish community. Now, I think that out of these tragic events of the 20th century came this new way of dialogue. It came about because it involved a taking stock, especially within the Christian world, a time of very painful self-examination as Christians asked themselves what their traditions had done to contribute to this, I don't know, what would you call it? These terrible, terrible wars. In this longer paper, then, I talk about Lutheran Christians who wondered how this could have happened in Germany, the land of Martin Luther, and the great traditions of thought and music. And as one who was raised in this Lutheran tradition, it was painful to discover that this anti-Semitism had been there in the very writings of Martin Luther in the 1500s at the time of the Reformation. Luther had also earlier in his life said remarkable and positive things about the Jewish tradition, but in 1543 he had written on the Jews and their lies and urged the burning of synagogues and schools, the razing of Jewish homes, and the destruction of all Jewish prayer books and Talmudic writings. For me, as a Lutheran Christian, this was extremely painful to realize. It was also painful for the Catholic tradition